So you're all set with internet. How were you able to connect? Yeah, it works. This is good. Can we turn it a little bit more? So, can everyone hear me? We're going to get started. First, just as a quick kind of announcement, if anyone needs to percussive, there's a room if you go out to the left next to the men's washroom. I think it's called the Tony Custer Room. It is unlocked, and that is free for whoever wants to use it. Also, the halls have some quiet corners as well if you need to learn. So thank you all for coming. So welcome to Reimagining Somali Studies, Colonial Past, Postcolonial Futures. My name is Sophia Aidid. I'm a PhD student here in the History Department at Harvard and the organizer of this two-day event. Tonight we have the pleasure of opening with the keynote lecture by Dr. Ali Jamal Ahmed, who will be introduced in detail a little later. And tomorrow we'll have a full day workshop over in Robinson Hall with presentations by critical scholars in the field of Somali Studies, many of whom are emerging young scholars and early career academics, but also established senior scholars. So you can actually grab a copy of the program just on the table there near the door on your way out, or during the reception afterwards, which will take a break after the lecture for about 10 minutes for catering to set up, and then have a reception here in this room. So this event, needless to say, I think is quite important. Many people also think of it as really a juncture and a really important critical moment for us to think about new directions for Somali studies. Really, it's a unique convergence for academics and practitioners interested in formulating new ways of thinking and analyzing the Somali territories and diaspora. What we have here today and tomorrow is a group of individuals who initiated and saw in the debates over the state of Somali studies over the last year a new space, a new place from which to examine the conceptual apparatus of the field, to interrogate the relations of power shaping academic knowledge production, and most importantly, to imagine new possibilities for scholarship about the Somali territories and diaspora. And that's why this event is called Reimagining Somali Studies. It represents both a possibility and potential. It's also just on a more personal level, as well as professionally, it's been a joy for me to be involved as I have in this project, in this movement over the last year. And it's been an honor for me to convene this gathering here at Harvard University. So with that, I'll introduce Dean Claudine Gay, who will be giving welcoming remarks on behalf of our sponsors, Harvard University Center for African Studies and the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. Dean Claudine Gay is the Dean of Social Science and the Wilbur A. Cowett Professor of Government and African American Studies at Harvard University. Her research and teaching interests are in the fields of American political behavior, public opinion, and race and ethnic politics. Before joining the Department of Government in September 2006, Dean Gay was Assistant Professor of Political Science at Stanford from 2000 to 2005, and tenured Associate Professor from 2005 to 2006. From 1999 to 2000, Dean Gay was a visiting fellow in the Public Policy Institute of California. Gay earned her PhD from the Department of Government here at Harvard in 1998 and was awarded the department's Taubman Prize for the best dissertation in political science that year. Gay's research has considered the effects of descriptive representation on citizens' orientations towards their government, the role of neighborhoods in shaping the racial and political attitudes of Black Americans, the roots of competition and cooperation between minority groups, and the effects of concentrated poverty on political engagement. Her work has been published in Political Psychology, the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, and the Journal of Politics. So please join me in welcoming Dean Claudine Gay.
Thank you for that very kind introduction. I just honestly am up here just to simply add my voice to the welcome that Sophia extended. And I do so on behalf of the Center for African Studies. CAS is proud to sponsor this conference, and in this I speak for both the CAS leadership as well as the many faculty affiliates who are part of the CAS community. And I think one of the reasons why the center was excited about this series of this two-day workshop is because it fits squarely within the center's overall intellectual agenda to promote theory from the South. And by that, I refer to the effort to really showcase African trends and scholarship that reimagines and reframes some key debates in African studies. And this conference, I think, as Sophia so eloquently explained, brings together established and emerging scholars of Somalia and from Somalia and the diaspora. And in that way, it's really exemplary of the kind of work that CAS wants to be a part of and CAS wants to support. And I'm particularly struck when I was looking at the agenda, just the broad array of really urgent and important questions that you're going to be wrestling with over the next couple of days on statehood, on identity, on globalization, on religion. And just to judge by even sort of a surface level reaction to the titles, you have a truly exciting and stimulating series of conversations that you're about to embark on over the next couple of days. And I'm excited for you, and I'm excited that CAS was able to play a role in bringing this to fruition. So, I know that the activities start right now, and I do not want to stand in the way of that. So I will sit down and sort of let the action get started. But thank you again for being here.
So now I'd like to introduce Abdulatif Ige, who will be giving our introductory remarks for our keynote. Abdulatif Ige is a Somali writer and scholar based in Harlem, New York. He's also a PhD candidate in the Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian, and African Studies at Columbia University, and the author of Guban, meaning burnt, a novel set in a moment of great tension and transition in Somalia, in post-colonial Somalia, tracing the lives of a family and indeed the narrative of a society caught between tradition and modernity, the global Cold War and socialism, military dictatorship, clanism, corruption, what doesn't it cover? So he's also now working on a new novel called Musa, Chronicle of the American Dream through the gaze of an African immigrant yearning to return home after years in North America. Please join me in welcoming Abdulatif Ige.
Thank you so much, Sophia, and all of you who are here today. And trying to figure out how to fit my computer on top of this one. And I might, Howard, are you streaming this? Okay, good.
No,
Okay, okay, I'll make it. Okay, not from there. Just leave it. Sorry, I think I'll figure out something. Iska warama. So nawad kusodawada Boston. Yeah, and I'm really happy in an interesting way to be here. This is a place where one of my favorite scholars, W. Du Bois, gave a valedictorian speech that critiqued the old idea of the South. And it's poignant at this moment that we're looking at reimagining Somali studies and the basic domination and of the West in many ways. If nothing else, sheer production of scholars who study Africa. So his life is interesting in that he was contracted to do the Philadelphia Negro and couldn't get an office at UPenn. And so follow that stream. Harvard is also the place where one very significant member of the Somali Studies used to produce all those volumes you've seen, almost 10 of them, 11 of them. Hussein Adam and Gesheka, I think is the last name. Somebody correct me if that's, it's Gesheka or Geshaka? Gesheka, yes. And that has given me, I don't know about other people, quite a lot of good reading and Ali, I think Ali follows from that time, and it was a bit later. And he was around for many events. I had a little conversation with him before, and I asked him what it is that led you to this path. And there was a little comparative there with C.L.R. James in the sense of the beginnings, in the sense of him watching this cricket field and having his mother's books on the shelf. So when he couldn't watch the cricket, he would, this is C.L.R. James, he would read the books, and from there he had a trajectory of a life of a multidisciplinary life that involved commentating on cricket and writing about all sorts of things. Ali, by the fifth grade, had subscriptions to the Sunday Nation in Nairobi. His house, one of the most influential people he told me to him was his mother, in the sense of how she, the word we use today is host, and what's the other thing that we use when people sort of like bringing people together. And every Fridays they would come there, and musicians, poets, and this is the beginning of Ali's trajectory towards the life of the mind. So it's a very early beginning. He also had subscriptions to Middle Eastern newspapers. So already there's a big outlook there that is larger than Mogadishu, larger than the continent, looking at the entire world as a, you know, in sort of like an insurgent diasporian way, like within home, looking outside and looking at it. So there are a lot of, if I started reading the credentials he has, there's quite a lot. And this is what I had the computer for, so I'll just make it plain. Another minute. A special lecture, Afro-Arab Relations. I'll actually begin before and give you a little bit of the bio. Ali Jamal Ahmed, PhD, UCLA, is Professor and Chair of Comparative Literature at Queens College of the City University of New York, where he teaches for the Africana Studies program and the Department of Classical, Middle Eastern, and Asian Languages and Culture. He also is on the Comparative Literature faculty at CUNY Graduate Center. His books, some of which have been adopted for courses in universities around the world, include The Invention of Somalia, 1995, Daybreak is Near, Literature, Clans, and the Nation State in Somalia, 1996, Fear is a Cow, 2002, Diaspora Blues, 2005, The Road Less Traveled, Reflections on the Literature of the Horn of Africa, co-edited, 2008, and When Donkeys Give Birth to Cows, Totems, Wars, Horizons, Diasporas, 2012. His poetry and short stories have been translated to several languages, including Japanese, Danish, Portuguese, Turkish, and the languages spoken in the former Yugoslavia. He has given lectures on topics that include African literature, September 11th, and its impact on the Afro-Arab relations, on poetry, politics, and peace, on religion, pluralism, and the secular state, on African democracy and identity, on Somali diaspora, on the role of intellectual in nation building, on cultural construction, on gender and Somali literature and history, and on literature and conflict in Africa. His lecture tours have taken him to several universities in Canada, Japan, Italy, Finland, and the US. Ahmed has been invited as an expert speaker to the US State Department, the United Nations, the United States Institute for Peace, and the US National Academy of Sciences. Selected presentations: presentation on Somali literature, the state of studies of this literature, and Ahmed's current research. Conference on Northeast African Literature, Princeton University, Princeton, New Jersey, 2010. In delineating the purpose of the symposium, the convener, Professor Wendy Bledger, wrote, "No previous seminar or workshop dedicated to Northeastern African literature has been held, although Ali Ahmed published a volume of essays on the topic, The Road Less Traveled, Reflections and so forth. We have gone through that in the past. Keynote lecture, Somali proverbs, Somali language, and literacy conference, Minnesota Humanities Center, 2005. Keynote speaker, September 11, and Afro-Arab Relations, 2004, 50th anniversary of Japanese Black Studies Association, Kobe City University, Kobe, Japan. Special lecture, Afro-Arab Relations after September 11, Graduate School of International Development, Nagoya University. Nagoya, Japan, 2004. Special lecture, Negri Beyond Negri, Lessons on a Manifesto for the 21st Century, Sapporo Gakuin University, Hokkaido, Japan, 2004. And the list goes on. And so I'll do what Malcolm used to say, to make it plain. I'll let you come up and do this.
Thank you, Abdulatif, for that generous, really, introduction. As Abdulatif was introducing me, I sort of remembered of a joke that you find in Freud, in jokes and the subconscious, where he says there was this fellow who at one point, there was a kind of a party, and someone says, do you know that fellow? And the fellow says, yes, I know him. That is the Minister of Agriculture or something. And he says, that fellow had his past, his future in the past. In the sense that when Abdulatif sort of really talked about, there are times that I also think that I had my future in the past. That's it. It's really strange sometimes. Thank you, Safia, for and the dynamic, really young Somalis who have literally and audaciously at the same time taking so many people to task. And thank you, all of you here tonight, in sharing this with Safia and this venerable institution. Now, the title of our workshop, Reimagining Somali Studies, Colonial Pasts, Postcolonial Futures, captures the essence, the gist of my speech this evening. Imagination, in the sense I propose to use it here, is the locus or site where the present meets and intersects with the past and that which is to come. To paraphrase Arjun Apodrai, imagination thus perceived becomes a potent social force in the creation of identity. Indeed, my initial title, actually, the one that I wanted to sort of really use instead of the long view, at one point was Forging Ahead on Hind Legs, Legitimation Crisis in Somali Studies. A crisis is always arrived at when organisms, individuals, societies, regimes, etc., come to a sticking point. To extricate themselves from a predicament, organisms must reinvent and reconfigure. For Jürgen Habermas, a legitimation crisis is directly an identity crisis. What the title of a workshop points to then is the need to rethink Somali studies. The task before me this evening, therefore, is threefold. Rereading its past with gimlet critical eyes, guided by empathy, diligence, and generosity. 2, understanding and reflecting on its blind spots. 3, attempting to improve on its unfinished projects by lending support to Safia Aidid's audacious project that has forced us to take stock of what she called Adani studies, or whiteness studies, not whiteness studies. The sobriquet sounds provocative, polemical, in the sense of a reincarnated Polykaja Tond. The Polykaja, this is a Yoruba word at one point where there were a group of intellectuals in Nigeria who wanted to take Woli Shoyinka to task. And they said Polykaja, which literally means come down, let's fight. While the speech is guided by these three clusters, it nonetheless looks at all three facets of the frame with critical eyes. Let me start with the last point first. Safiya Aidid's shot across the bow is meant to reclaim and revitalize the ramparts of an organization that has survived through the best part of the last 2 decades on a certain ad hoc basis. The association seemed orphaned by the absence, by the disintegration of the Somali state, and because of life's vagaries and vicissitudes, by the absence of its dynamic founder, Professor Hussein Muhammad Adam, Tanzania, and more on Hussein later on. Adani Studies reveals the locus of a controversy, whose polysemous signifiers compel us to peel off epistemological, racial, ontological, and ethical entanglements. It reveals or brings to the fore the unequal relations between center and periphery. Of course, when I say between center and periphery, of course, even in that periphery, there are unequal relations. But now we are talking about in terms of center and periphery. In short, then, Adani Studies wrestles with this question: who has the power to represent the Somali, in places the Somali subject herself, in a place where the Somali subject finds herself off limits? The question of representation is crucial and central to any discussion of who speaks. The intention of Adani Studies is to interrogate then the class of interpreters whose intellectual labor produces and generates the prism through which the Somali subject is viewed, analyzed, and comprehended. What it proposes, I take it, is a rigorous and multi-layered examination of the claims made by the made about the Somali subject and the enunciator who frames or articulates the enunciation. In short, the project Adani Studies inaugurates what it inaugurates is, to borrow from Edward Said, an epistemological critique, unquote. Episteme here, from the Greek word for knowledge, encompasses, as Foucault would argue, power and the institutions through which social values are shaped and articulated. Safiya Aidid's initial project was launched on social media as part of #activism. I will, in what follows, call the project instead a manifesto to describe the depth and gumption of Aidid's concept. My use of the term concept here also is best captured by Herbert Marcuse, who writes, quote, "Concept is taken to designate the mental representation of something that's understood, comprehended, known as the result of a process of reflection." Here I must acknowledge Dr. Rima, that most of you know, Rima Burns-McGowan, as the first person who, to my knowledge, has used the term manifesto to describe Safiya's project. Professor Burns-McGowan's essay on the subject will appear in a forthcoming issue of the Journal of Somali Studies, of which Safiya, Abdulatif, and so many people here, Bhakti is here, myself are on the editorial board. Now, I'll say something about, there is a reason that I'm using, quote unquote, white scholars. but I am driving, and you'll see where I'm going with this. David Graham Burnett, through Janet Leon, traces the etymology of the word manifesto to a Latin composite of manus and fictus, which literally means hostile hand. The manifesto is, in other words, a genre that gives the appearance of being at once both word and deed, both threat and incipient action. In this sense, Aidid's manifesto aims at challenging existing forms of knowledge, while at the same time initiating a new form of discursive practice. As part of a genre, Aidid's manifesto shares etymology with other manifestos. They, like the epic form, for example, appear in clusters around those political crises that involve definitions of citizenship and political subjectivity. It's this historical awareness that also helps Adani Studies to tap into other discursive practices and forms that challenge established epistemology. Whiteness studies, I'll sort of, because later on, most of the things that I'm talking about will literally sort of, I hope, we'll talk about this in the Q&A. So I will skip certain parts so that we'll have discussion time for questions and answers. Whiteness studies deals with the position of minorities in Western countries, as well as non-Western peoples, or the ones without history in other parts of the world. My intention here is not to replicate what has been said by different authors, nor to perpetuate a sense of what the Guyanese novelist and critic Wilson Hurst calls victim stasis and victor stasis. Rather, my intention is to show the ingenuity of the phrase Adani Studies would accomplish for me two related things. It de-ghettoizes Somali studies, and in the process demonstrates how the Somali question is related to discussions of some alternative and of the processes that relegate indigenous scholars to liminal places. Magan Keita, in a book, wonderful book really, Magan Keita in Race and the Writing of History, lucidly expounds on the vicious tentacles of racialized categories. He discusses the toll racialized thinking took on the lives of brilliant scholars, including W.E.B. Du Bois, Carter Woodson, and Dr. Charles Wesley. These scholars were not allowed to publish their research in leading journals of the time. Keita writes, from 1895 to 1980, only 14 pieces of scholarship authored by Black intellectuals had been accepted in the leading white journals, and of those, only 5 dealt with Black themes. Unquote. Keita also contextualizes the topic by juxtaposing diverse notions of the theme of race. He quotes from A.J. Kelso on physical anthropology, and he writes, he says, race, he says, explains nothing at all, unquote. This claim, though, is compared and contrasted with Du Bois' explication of the centrality of race in souls of Black folk. Keita then brings the conversation closer to our times when he discusses the 1980s controversy surrounding Martin Bernali's Black Athena. The controversy, as you remember, was spearheaded by scholars who, as Molly Levine explained, saw the drift and tenor of Black Athena as a challenge to classics today. What Levine and other scholars' apprehension and anxiety underline is this: upholders of tradition are almost always rattled and unnerved by newer discourses that take them to task. This is best captured in a Somali proverb that says, "Ado la burriya, aro allay leedahay," meaning an abandoned custom brings forth the wrath of Allah. That's why tradition and entrenched cultural beliefs are best reconfigured by tampering with the ideological grid that sustains them. Yet, Bernard himself acknowledges that his color pigmentation deflected some of the more outrageous criticisms leveled against him. He says, "My ideas are still so outrageous that I'm convinced that if I, as their proposer, did not have all the cards stacked in my favor, I would not have enjoyed even a first hearing." Now, of course, you all know about the invention of Africa, Movimbe. You know about Gugi with Yongo, and I will spare you. I will not really belabor this and rehash. The idea of de-ghettoizing Somali studies is important for me, and I think this is what Safia and her company is really doing. And in that sense, now that I talked about African American studies, African studies, I would say something about this sort of problem that is also found in Asian studies. In a critique of Professor Stephen Owen, who was a doyen here at Harvard University, in a critique of Professor Stephen Owen's arguments about effacing traces of national identity in the poetry of non-Western poets, whose poems, because of their translatability, enjoy wide circulation, Ray Chow points out what she sees as the veteran sinologist's blind spots. She writes, quote, "What's absent from Owen's musings is an account of the institutional investments that shape his own enunciation. This absence constitutes a definite form of power by not drawing attention to itself and thus not subjecting itself to the harsh judgment of self-interest that is so useful in criticizing others," unquote. Chow then connects her critique of Owen to Said's Orientalism and how Said's concepts were vilified and maligned by scholars whose arguments went something like this: "How dare you ingrates criticize the pioneering work of Western scholars on non-Western subjects, who, if it were not for the valiant work of these scholars, would not be on the map." Here, Chow goes for the jugular. And when she writes, "I have indicated elsewhere," she says, "that we need to acknowledge the significance of this type of work as sharing an esteem with primatology," unquote. As much as this sounds indecorous, and it seems to me a bit strong statement, we must remember that such comparisons still subsist in Western writings about and on the non-Western world. Here, my intention is not to assume an undifferentiated whole that's called non-Western. Be that as it may, let me draw your attention to two pieces of evidence from the Somali scene that would lend credence to Ray Chow's formulation of the problematic. The first evidence comes in the form of a book title and a quotation from that same book. The second is a quotation from a Western diplomat confiding in an American journalist. The book title is from none other than the venerable the late I.M. Lewis, Blood and Bone, the Call of Kinship in Somali Studies. Before I go any further, though, let me mention what I said about the late venerable scholar some 15 years ago, where I said I must state my genuine respect for Lewis. Lewis was a prolific writer whose work for the better part of the last century tried to grapple with some aspects of the Somali question. I do not doubt his sincerity and devotion to his subject. Curiously, in his eyes, Somali clanism, for example, refuses to become, to borrow from James Clifford, quote, ethnography's disappearing object, unquote. I also tend to believe that he takes his work rather seriously. His perspective is rooted in anthropology, and I believe some of our differences with him may emanate from ideological differences. Be that as it may, his view about his subject are informed by what I call an ethic-oriented approach. That was in 2001 in Finland when I say that. Now, fast forward to 2013. In a review of a Festschrift celebrating Lewis's long and illustrious career, edited by none other, Marcus Hain and the late Virginia Lulling, I wrote, neither vilifying nor canonizing Lewis's work would contribute to our knowledge of Somali society and culture. Lewis is a scholar who's worth his weight in praise. The praiseworthy, because of the sheer magnitude of their accomplishments, are also blameworthy. The contributions to this volume attest to the towering height of Lewis's shadow over things Somali. A man of his time, he certainly got something strong. The job of good disciples is twofold: to keep the master's work in focus and in demand, while at the same time believing in the incompleteness of the work. The aim should never be to make us card-carrying Lewisites, for then we would lose track of the depth of his work and inquiry. Rather, the aim should be to go beyond him. And then I posed a question, which went something like this. Might it not perhaps be appropriate to write a piece entitled, quote, Lewis Beyond Lewis? And I said, in answer to my own question, that shouldn't be a bad idea after all. Now, enough of my rigmarole. I go back to the quote that I wanted to now read to you, but I was sort of really going through this rigmarole to give him the credit that the late veteran Somalicist really deserves. The quote is here. Lewis writes, the collapse of the colonially created state represents technically a triumph for the segmentary lineage system and the political power of kinship. Given then, like nationalism, clanship is a human invention. Is it not in the 1990s basically the same phenomenon that it was in the 1890s? Linguistically, the answer must be yes, since the same terminology has been employed throughout the recorded history of Somalia. Sociologically, he says, the evidence also supports this view. Indeed, the argument of this book is that clanship is and was essentially a multi-purpose, culturally constructed resource of compelling power because of its ostensibly inherent character, bred in the bone and running in the blood, unquote. Lewis suggests here, and rightly so, that clan is a human invention, which literally means, for me, that it is socially constructed. Yet Lewis, in the above sentences, reveals the contradictions that for so long beset his arguments. These contradictions are conveyed in carefully choreographed words that hide the anxiety dotting the landscape of the text. In my review of the Festschrift mentioned above, I question the assumptions that inform Lewis's work and other writers, including myself. I speak of the need to interrogate one of Lewis's blind spots, namely the dialectical relationship that emerges from what Mary Louise Pratt calls the contact zone. And these were the questions that I asked of Lewis's work, which is also relevant to the work that I see my good friend here, Lee, I see my good friend Lalan here, but myself. These are relevant questions. And these were the questions that I asked. What kind of pressure, for example, did colonialism exert on the clan system to effect structural service, and deep transformations? How much of what Lewis saw of the clan system was the result of these pressures? What sort of mechanisms did he put in place to separate the seemingly pre-colonial and colonial constructions? How did Lewis's unconscious reading of the world affect his reading of the clan system? These questions are not only pertinent, as I said, to Lewis's work, they are all the more relevant to this scholarship that nowadays is paraded as short-footed. And that is the sort of scholarship that Somali Studies is really taking to task. Lewis's words lend credence to Rachau's quibble with the scholars who consciously or unconsciously conflate knowledge of the non-Western human and that of the primates. In short, how could one escape from the call and howl of his or her genetic destiny? The second evidence now comes from Jonathan Stevenson's Losing Mogadishu. Quoted from a Western diplomat, he writes, telling a Somali, he says, telling a Somali to kill is like telling a dog to lick his balls. The trouble is getting him to stop. This is what Stevenson hears from a Western diplomat. Notice the animalistic imagery and the terms employed to convey homicidal tendencies of the Somali, for whom killing is purely instinctual. The last evidence, of course, is not uttered by a scholar, academic, anthropologist, but both pieces of information point to the prevalence of gossip as a form of knowledge. In Woman, Native, Other, Triminha writes the kind of truth inherent in gossip, which literally means gossip in the Old English, we speak together about others. She writes, the kind of truth it claims to disclose is a confidential truth that requires commitment from both the speaker and the listener. Maligned and mocked, thus can the subaltern then speak. The question is perhaps best reformulated. Here I'm talking about Spivak. Can the subaltern speak? Which Safia and so many of you have really brilliantly formulated. But for me, the question perhaps is, can the subaltern grunt or whisper? Spivak's question foregrounds the impatience inherent in speaking. That is speech that's willed. That's why the native's speech is never really captured by, quote, Mr. Curtis, he dead. Those of you who have read Conrad's Heart of Darkness would remember, Mr. Curtis, he dead. Nor is that speech articulated in the colonizer's text. Yet, by trying to stifle the subaltern's speech, authority only foregrounds that which it suppresses. Here, in other words, it's really difficult to stifle that sort of consciousness. And I'll give you an example that which I think is relevant to this situation. It's in the form of an anecdote where there was this cook who was always abused by his master. One day, supposedly the master had an epiphany of a sort. He calls him, the cook that is, and he says, you know what, from now on, I'll be nice to you. And the cook looks up at him and says, is that true, sir? And he says, yeah. And he says, sir, from now on, I will not spit in the soup. So the spitting in the soup literally is a form of a struggle after all. in the sense that you, every time that he spit in the master's soup, he was saying, I am better than you. Now, these examples, though, point to a kind of resistance that knows its limits, but which is not strictly delimited. It is generative, restorative, in that it stocks the master even in its most vulnerable moments. It's here where Adani Studies then inverts the gaze. The erstwhile gazer is now gazed. This is done through an elaborate indigenous system that repackages the ontological and taxonomic grids upon which the master's gaze gains its hegemony. I'll skip this part and I will go the importance of again talking about Adani Studies in the sense of modernity and modernization. And by modernity, I mean the consciousness. And here we have to really remember that Hegel, of all people actually, in the phenomenology of spirit, you will remember he was writing this book. He had just finished the phenomenology of the spirit. And he's looking out the window, his window, in his study room. And that is a moment when the French defeated the Russian forces, which was sort of really heir to the Roman Empire. And Hegel had this epiphany. And this is when he says, the end is here, he says. Of course, you have heard of, as you know, Fukuyama writing the end of history, etc., which I thought was really a stupid sort of jumping the guns, basically. But this is what he said, Hegel, the end is here. And in a way, if you think about it though, that master had some sort of wisdom, for lack of a better term, that the end actually was there in the sense of globalization today, in the sense of modernity and modernization, etc., etc. Now, a successful critique then, for me, of the West's narcissism would require us to reflect on the importance of the intersections between theory and politics. Now, we talked about Spivak, I talked about Rachel in the case of China. Now I'll talk about a little bit in terms of the Japanese and Western scholarship. And here again, my aim really is to really show that the need, there is this need for all of us to de-ghettoize Somali studies. There's nothing really exceptional sometimes, even though we like to call ourselves, to think that we are very sort of, that we are exceptional. We have this problem. And this problem cuts across countries, across continents, across nations. Now, a successful critique, as I said before, of the West's narcissism would require us to reflect on the importance of the intersections between theory and politics. Naoki Sakai, in Translation and Subjectivity, insists that the problem of theory, he says, in Asian, for our case, African Somali studies, is primarily, he says, a political one. Adani Studies questions then, for me, the enunciative positionality of experts in Somali studies. Theory, however, need not be seen as a ploy in the hands of Western scholars whose aim it is to use theory, to quote from Homi Bhabha, a strategy of containment. Now, when you talk about theory and African studies, African American studies, you would remember this long tradition of Henry Gates here, up here. You'll remember Houston Baker. You'll remember at one point where Skip Gates, Professor Gates, sort of really says, he was talking to Houston Baker, and he says, how do you expect us to speak to Tudorov, the Bulgarian French theoretician? And he says, how do you think we could be able to speak to him if we still speak in the talk, our talk of the talk, African American that is? And Appiah then enters the fray and says that there is really, after all, race as a category is useless, he says, because of the mitochondria, and he talks about the mitochondria. Then comes in Houston Baker, who says, that's fine by me, he says, so long as the taxi driver in New York, when I wave him, he looks at the mitochondria and doesn't see me, he says, which is really important if you think about it, really. Now, in the review of Hein and Loring's book that I mentioned before, I found a note of skepticism about his article on Somali nicknames and their meaning. And I argued in that article that Hein's article would have benefited from a comparative analysis of names drawn from Somali and say German, the writer's culture that is. What would a reader learn from knowing that Essel, Bauer, or Burke mean, respectively, donkey, farmer, and mountain, without discussing the wider social, political, cultural, linguistic, and economic implications of name giving? What is in a name after all? And here's what I'm driving with this. The unfortunate thing most of the time is really the people who write about Somalia and Somali studies are people who do not even know their own country. And therein lies the problem. And I'll give you an example, two examples actually. At one point, I was giving a speech at York, a keynote speech a while back, in 1999, I think it was. And I talked about the plight of Somali women and the plight of Muslim women. And there was a lady from Denmark, I think, a professor from Denmark, who in the Q&A asked me and said, talking about the Somali women and the plight they were in. And I said, yes, they are abused, but so are women in the West also. That we have to really remember. Of course, it's a question of degrees. Then I asked her, I said, are you married? And she said, yeah. And I said, who gave you away? And she said, of course, my father. And I said, if the father was not there, who will give you away? She said, my brother, my uncle. And I said, whatever became of your mother? Where is the mother after all? That was one. Years ago again, we were writing a book called Faces of Islam in African Literature. And there was a symposium at East Lansing, I think, Michigan. And there was this anthropologist who talked about the Hausa and kept on saying, if I asked a Hausa herder, how many heads of cattle do you have? Or how many kids do you have? They kept on saying, I'm blessed, I'm blessed. And the anthropologist basically was saying, what, am I an albino sort of who's going to snatch their kids or their animals? And I looked at him and I said, how much money do you have in your savings account? And he, seriously, how much money do you have in your savings account? He looked at me and he said, what sort of question is that? That's uncalled for. And I said, that's exactly what they were telling you. You see? And therein lies the problem. But to be fair to others, though, we are all implicated in the sort of cultures that we are in. After all, we are humans, you see, that we do not really see the sort of dirt on your doorstep, when in fact you can see the dirt on your neighbor's roof. Now, I will skip some points And here I would hope that at the end of this workshop, we would be able to have a clear sense of where we are, what needs improving, developing, and where we go from here. If there is a disjuncture between the Somali represented to the West and the real Somali, we must be willing to formulate what the new representations should be. Let's start with defining the contours of our intractable Achilles heel clan. We must deconstruct clan optics through which we become privy to a totalizing grand narrative. The kind of deconstruction that I have in mind is best captured by Lyotard here. A différende, he says, is not simple divergence precisely to the extent that its object cannot enter into the debate without modifying the rules of the debate. We have to find plausible explanations to such vexing questions. And here, we have to really remember, think in terms of that African, the Congolese woman who couldn't sort of really make sense of what was going on during Mobutu's time. And she says, when will this independence come to an end? But think about it. When will this independence come to an end? Or in the case of South America, for example, the Libertador Simón Bolívar, for example, where at one point he was asking, someone said, General, now that we are free, tell us what to do. What do we do now? Where do we go? Where do we go from here? Now, and there is the aporia, really, that one has to think about. We must also examine proleptically the point of differentiation when clan interests will divert and cede ground to who eats whose stars. That sort of classical definition of politics, the Lassallean sort of who gets what, when, and how and when. In other words, it becomes really important to understand that this thing that we call clan itself is sort of a fetish, really, that we have to sort of go past it and analyze it. And I'll give you an example. There was this lady in the South of America, in Alabama, at one point during the civil rights movement in this country. And some journalists went to the lady and said, now that Ralph Bunche, you remember Ralph Bunche, the Undersecretary General of the United Nations, and he says, now that you are, that he is the Secretary General, aren't you really happy? And she says, the food on his table will not satisfy my hunger. That's the classic imperative. The class really becomes important. Now, if we accomplish some of our objectives at this gathering, we would give Safia Aidid and this institution that have given us this forum and afforded us this opportunity to share our sense of accomplishment, a sense of knowing that a new era has again started from the halls of Harvard, a new beginning that has had its origins at this institution. For it was Professor Hussein Adam, an alumnus, who founded the Somali Studies International Organization more than 36 years ago. We have come back to the old place to reflect and take stock of what has happened since. This is a retreat for us with the goal of replenishing for the next 3 decades. Who said you could not return to the crib once you had left? But this return, though, is dialectical. Dialectical in the sense of Cabralian, return to the source, dialectical in the sense of Walter Benjamin, in the sense that neither really the place nor the returnees and those who were born after are the same. Because if you take a journey and you come back to a place, the place is no longer the same, and you are not really the same because you have accumulated experiences after all. Finally, in a strange sort of way, we must thank the editors of the new journal that forgot to have a Somali on their editorial or advisory boards. They are the ones who gave us this opportunity to regroup and interact. and reconnect. They certainly gave Safiya Aidid a renewed sense of purpose. Her manifesto has roots in Somali consciousness, in that you find poetic snippets that subtly challenge all forms of hegemony, as my mother used to say. And this is really interesting. She used to say, and I never really understood until when I read what Safiya was talking about. She used to say, San Adalo Sidi at Raptay Sami Lubi. Think about it. San Adalo, of course, yesterday I was talking to a Somali writer, Ahmed Yusuf, in Minneapolis. And I said, Ahmed, how would you define San Adale? San Adale literally means the white-skinned. But in the evolution process of Somali language, it has taken a different usage in the sense that here you are talking about yeah, he who is cursed, or he whose intent is evil, or he who brings no good with himself, or he who is with no beneficence. Of course, this is, we're not really, and you see what I'm going to say about this, but this is San Adali. And it's really strange that my mother, some 40 years ago, say this to me. San Adalo Sidi at Rabtay. San, which now defetishizes the idea of that hegemony, in the sense she was saying this won't really be possible for you from now on. Now, without essentializing the argument, let me, with some trepidation, posit this. Perhaps the struggle out of this rut that we find ourselves in is best formulated and led by Somali women, and, to quote from Mariama Ba, all men of goodwill, unquote. Hein and the editors of the new journal reminded me of the parable of the lady who came into a town only to be refused hospitality for the night. And here you find this in Trimenhal's book, Woman Native Arab. There was this woman who came to a town. She wanted someone to help her, and they said, no, we can't give you any hospitality. She goes outside the town and spends the night on a mountain. Then early in the morning, the rays of the sun, and she says, thank you, town. Were it not for your cruelty, I could not see the light, basically, she was saying. That said, what we need is to guard, and here's what I'm driving at. What we need is to guard against all forms of spite, that we must not engage in any form of demonology. In short, our discussions should transcend heuristic writing and wrangling for the sake of wrangling. Rather, the aim should be to find solutions to the myriad problems that still abound in our parts of the world. Let then this be, quote, wounded kinship's last resort. And I quote from the American poet Nathaniel McKee, where he says, wounded kinship's last resort. Let this be really. And to conclude then, Aidid's name in Somali is the one who does not accept insult, who does not accept to be slighted. Her name. Thank you.
Where is
The microphone. hear me? Oh, hello.
No.
Uh,
It's not working? Yeah, this one is taped down.
actually just remove that.
Yeah, but it's taped.
There's another mic here.
Okay, why not?
You're fine?
Yeah.
Okay, okay.
The wireless is
You just came.
Maybe you can just acknowledge. What is that?
Please.
What might be? Oh, it's like kind of.
So do it.
Yeah.
The person that was Dr. Hussein Adam is here. Sometimes we may call you that. Yeah. Thank you for showing up. This gentleman is responsible for the beginnings. He's talking about. They're coming back to the cradle. We are now open for questions. No local matters, meaning you would questions. A good person without the usual routine. And most of the questions are more, I'm acting as the moderator. Okay, so all the way in the back.
Somali. Really appreciate to see Professor Anis Mahada and the rest of Somali Studies, because the United States the people great Boston, because Boston is a city of education, and all the revolutions come from Boston.
Why? I saw them away. That swallows is not there. So.
We have students who are accepted in Harvard from Boston. So you are educators. How can we motivate our young students to learn Somali American? We bring the education in Somali. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think we should start first with that Somali program. لما هوران وعاوز كتير. That's how we should start. Anyone who is willing to translate. Yeah. لما هوران, yes. وعاوز كتير. Yes, please. So, the necessity is the dry grass which are green. Right. When it drought, the dry grass is better than a good grass when you have the dry. Right.
Okay. We just go move. Let's move on.
No, true. But it also really says, just to build on what you said, what it really says is, yes, you are here, yes, we are there, but in the final analysis, Somalia is home. East, west, home is best. That's what the Somali proverb says, actually. And that says, I think, the most important thing, and this is really what I believe, is there is a proverb in Tigrinya which says wasp. It says, I'm talking about the one that stings now, not wasp. So it says, oh wasp, it says, if you cannot give honey, then please do not sting. Yeah. If you cannot give honey, then please do not sting. So if you are able, first and foremost, charity begins at home. Home in the sense of the person now. You now become educated, but educated in the sense, really, and I think this is really very important. Education is not sort of really education. Education for me is best captured by the Chinese proverb that says, to know and not to act is not to know. If you say, I know something, and you are not going to act upon what you know, then you really don't know. What does that mean? Charity begins at home, that you are here, you build networks that transcend this problem really that we have, stupidity, the asinine sort of clan system, that we could really go beyond it. And once we go beyond it, we'll be able to build, hopefully, at least a society that's based on class, on something more tangible than clan. Because whoever really came up with that idea of clan to begin with, at least the way I see it, they live their life. Now, how would I be able to sort of allow myself to blindly follow things that were done by someone else 300, 400, 500 years ago? And in that sense, I think, to come back to a very important question, but charity begins at home, that you build networks.
Next, who? Yes, go ahead.
But again, we have to remember, we are talking about patriarchal questions, as you know. We live in male-dominated societies, whether one likes it or not. You see, all over the world. It's not only Somalia. In the case of Somalia, I think, literally, this country, Somalia, would not really be able to survive. It could not have survived the last 20 years, 30 years, without the goodwill of women. And this we have to really remember. It is because of the women that we are here talking about Somalia and this sort of thing. That said, at the same time, we have to really remember not to essentialize things. I'm not talking about all women. So many women that I know took part in the clan and the wars, that they fueled all these sort of things. Now, before, and even today. So I'm talking about women who really understand the dynamics of power differentials, and who literally strive for something beyond them. You see, that it doesn't really end with you, but at the same time also it should not really become. My fear sometimes is what's going on in the West, in the sense of women empowering women, when they say that sort of it becomes a kind of a Trojan horse sometimes. But it's really my fear sometimes. But what it becomes important is to really take patriarchal structures to task. And from now on, I don't think any Somali, male or wherever they come from, will be able to hold women back. That women have crossed that Rubicon. It's no longer really tenable for me, and what will be possible. But one, education; two, empathy, compassion, generosity for women for men of good, and the others think it's sort of really, what we were doing here is to send them back to Mars.
Next question. Next question. Oh, I'm sorry. Yes, go ahead.
So like many times like the knowledge that gained is a lot of times like defined is only accessible to those who exist in academia. So like how do we like thinking critically like these Somali studies and like critical like how do we make that knowledge accessible to those who like don't exist in academia?
That's a very important question, actually, because it becomes, what we are talking about really is an elite sort of kind of thing you are saying, which is really true. And knowledge that does not go beyond these halls is really no knowledge. That's what I meant by the Chinese proverb. To know and not to act is not to know. In other words, even our language should really be performative, you see. That, yes, we talk about knowledge because it's really important also to theorize and to think through issues, but at the same time also to remember that we need to go beyond ourselves, beyond the halls of these institutions, and to make sure that it not trickles down, but literally goes to the people. The best way that sort of, if you could write in Somali, for example, I think it would really be one of those important things to write in Somali, or write in a language that's accessible to the people, and translate. And translate. Abdulatif's wonderful, really brilliant book it is in the process of being translated in Somali by a Somali young man, I think, somewhere
in Sweden.
In Sweden. So I think we have to.
Boderi.
What's his name?
No, Boderi was son.
Oh, that's
ما علم لما يلعب سكر بودري كلي وين. Yeah.
I hope I answered your question.
Okay, the next question. I'm also a little nearsighted. There's some vanity here. Please raise. Yes, please, Idris. So Alex Salam. So Idris Mount.
And thank you for the fabulous presentation. And I think all of us like what you have talked about. It was well balanced. And my question is, I don't have a question first. I want to mention that maybe there's going to be a question. So this data is using arts and creative writing to use news stories, what's historical of Somalis, and that's what we need, I think, to be inspired by and follow your footsteps and maybe someone become novel to amplify that picture you have in your mind for the greatness of our people. Also, Somali people are rich in poetry, and we have folklore and folk stories. And
ninka kale ayaan kuuranay soo gabagabay. So that.
people that I know, like Peter,
Ayen.
translating our historic and folklore into English. What do you think? I feel like there's a slow process of translating all the information that we hold dear, and they are teaching us the aspects of the Somali society, both Muslim and negative as well. Do you think the new era of Somali studies is focused more on amplifying that rich culture we have in our literature? Because I feel I was reading Muslim Somali, also discussing wars and violence. It was always ending with like it was like a comedy. It was always ending with you laughing at the end. Although it was discussing some people being killed at the front. So what we need to amplify our culture. So do you think there's going to be a
Okay, I'll well, I think for me it's a bit. There seems to be a separation. I think Somalis and in the diaspora, and particularly in Somalia itself, are producing work every day. So the idea that that it's something that is left out and needs to be resuscitated. No, young poets are coming up every day. There are new singers. Cultural production is going on and on. So that I think the test will be how to find a bridge between those who are non-Somali speakers to the depth at that point, who are in the diaspora and things like that. That's what we'll be doing. But I think the culture in itself, the work itself, will continue. It's a living language. So, the idea that it's cornered in this place and it's gone, I think, is purely the aggrandizement of the position of the diaspora, thinking that they're actually at the center of Somalia, but they're really not. We're running concurrent. So that's how I see it, and so the task will be for all of us. And you have to understand, for example, music recently, the last decade, was centered mainly in the diaspora because of the people who found themselves domiciled in Minnesota and other places. But now you see that those who are locally in places like Hargeisa, other places, Mogadishu. I was at Mogadishu one time, and there was a guy on TEDx. And what is happening now is that the conversation is now coming back to Somalia, where the music that is being produced is now coming back and influencing the people who are working here. So that's what I mean by the cultural work being consistent with the living language. Yeah.
To add, you mentioned Musa Graf, the late Musa Graf. You are right, but we also have to remember that the humor that you find after the bloodshed, and the Somalis say, "Balayu watikabus lisa." Real catastrophe, they say. Real catastrophe is that which makes you laugh. What literally means you are going to laugh in order not to cry at all. So you keep your sanity, otherwise you go really. Another sort of maniac killing people. That's sense.
My question is for both I want to first thank you for your presentation. My question has to do with, of course, I think you both know that the peaceful question Muslim scholarship from the South and the world has been in academic discussion since the 60s and 70s, over study or these scholarship. It's sort of amazing that this hasn't happened in this one instead before now. Of course, for example, I am Bruce's work on Muslim, and particularly segmented images, is carving from the work of illustration on the work. And that has also been very heavy. And now it's from unprovided to program instead in order to enable students to be able to pick up candidates work. However, the same theory which I'm carrying over to Somalia and simplified in Somalia is in this day being used as though it was so why does it take Somalis in particular would have gone through Western higher education institutions? Question, this is not a corruption. Why? I mean, of course, I realize there aren't many Somalis that have gone through this process, but there are quite a few. And so I'm wondering what your take is on this. Why has it been so long? This issue has been in academic discussion.
I think what's missing in your comparative is the state of war. If you're comparing German scholars to Somali scholars, there must be been implemented, there's been a standstill in the sense of strife and war. So that, can explain some of it, 10 or 15 years of it at least. I'm not so concerned about the timing, and more that it is actually posed and what is the work ahead is what I would say. But as far as everything else, I really don't have an answer other than there has been, a significant derailment based on war and other things.
Let me, by the way, Ahmed Sharif is an anthropologist. He knows what he's talking about. And most of the times in my classes, when I'm asking a question by someone I think knows the answer, I always ask the student, how would you answer your own question? Yeah. So we'll come back to later on. But earlier, before we started, Howard and I were talking about something similar actually to that question. And in a way, you sort of think about saying here, Casanelli, Ladan, Solomon really started this a long time ago. But the critique was what Howard said was polite in those days. Polite in the sense of not sort of really stepping on one's toes. But there comes a time when you really, and that's how scholarship in the true sense of the word develops, but not to be sort of contentious, but to take them to task. And the time has come now. And that's what Sophia and companies do. But yeah, please do. Yeah.
Also using things that I separate one, because you have been talking about so here we talk about redecorating Somali studies, and I think one of the problems that came with the paradigm was that Somalis were always special. Really special to order to study Somali, and Somalis were special. And so we missed for a long time, I think, that comparative approach is actually everything that is going to be presented tomorrow. And in your own paper, what I see, using theory, using concepts that come from other places and sometimes from the country. So that, the uniqueness of Somali is that really this program. And the other thing, I see the parallel between it's always different the language-wise, these three. At the moment that Orientalism became criticized, and people said, okay, Islam is not one thing. You cannot use Islam for one text. We have Islamic jihad is now to say Islam is everything and Islam is anything. At the moment that people began to deconstruct Islam, we have actually in Somalia a war for the name of Islam, which is what you were saying. I think it's very good, right? And so I think those two things are explanatory, and I think having so many Somalis now, we have everywhere, in Africa, in the West, we really need the cause. And so yes, we are, we need the possibility of not doing.
Right. Add to that, there's something that the Moroccan, was it? Where did Bouchatra come from? Bakti is here. Yeah. Yeah. But where he was saying, if you see, Rabbi the messenger here, I'm only quoting from him. If you see SNIT, he said, someplace, don't skip on it, at least remove it. But yeah. That was the exact, that's my intention.
Howard, go ahead. I'll come to you later, Howard first. Ladies first.
My name is Howard, and I'm interested in for Somali folks in academia, how do we balance the about the resilience of Somali communities, the ongoing violence enacted based on different kinds of powers, clan membership, gender, sexuality,
Rewind.
So my question was, how do gender, women, and then sexuality in good cases people who identify from the variety of different specters.
And I think this is really a very important question. And you sort of will see where, when we talk about being in a rut, this is really a problem in a way. What happens, I think, there's one thing that I know. What the Somalis say, "Aina umakulna." Say, "Hey, aina umakulna." True. But if you sort of really think in terms of the resilience and the activism, I hope that the activism itself will become more resilient than the sort of splintering that always exists in our communities. But I remember at one point when, again, I was at Ottawa, I think, where I was talking about something, and people were saying, "Yes, we are Somalis." And I said, "I hope when you go home, you make sure that you remember what you said." But because the problem most of the times, as you know, someone will come to your house and you say, "Kids, come. Your uncle, your aunt." And by the time the person leaves there, the guest say, "Go fuck." That jerk, after all. And the kids sort of growing up in here, they split sort of personality in a way that will say, "But I thought you would say something nice about him, about her a little while ago." So in a way, once we really have our home house here in order, I think we could really take on these other problems. Because most of the times, if you think about it, really, what's going on in Somalia is in a way funded, if you will, and fueled by those of us who are outside Somalia, if you think about it. Now, the question of minorities and women, they are at the bottom right again. And think about, it has never, and this is when you sort of really see this split kind of personality that we have Somalis, where someone will say, "Wahoyala, Wawalasha, Waikudaha, Waikologalate," and then you hit her. It doesn't really make sense. It's saying she's your mother, she's your sister, she's your wife, she's your daughter, and yet you oppress her and you abuse her. It doesn't really make sense. But again, I think honestly, the charity begins at home. Unless here is where you remember that book, in Harlem actually during the 60s. Where I'm not talking about him. I'm not talking about him. Oops. I'm not talking about him. Black Man's Burden, you said, Black Man's Burden, where this kid comes to his father and he says, "Father, every time that people talk about a lion and a man fight, it's always the man who wins the fight, even though we know that the lion is more powerful than the man." And the father says, "Yes, son, it will always be like that until the lion tells its own version of what happened, until women tell their own version of this sort of really struggle." Now, the kind of, in terms of minority clans, it is beyond the pale, really. I don't know how to even explain it sometimes. Think about when someone says, "Kana nasabina." Just think about it. Good, noble clan, ignoble clan, 4.5. You think about, I am 4, you are 0.5, half human sort of. It doesn't really sort of, but all these sort of things, I think, by the way, Dr. Muhammad Aaron, that some of you have heard, has written books on this, where he calls the Bantu Berer, there is apartheid, he says, in Somalia. And he has written 4 poems now, 4 books of poems, poetry, really. But I think the important thing always is to organize, but at the same time also really know that real knowledge is that one that goes beyond you. that it's not intransitive. It should really be transitive, knowledge by its very nature.
I'm going to take one more, and then we have questions from. He's been waiting for a while, and then we'll have questions from online. We do live in the what is it? Internet. Well,
I do have a comment on what the other poet said. When you were, you could say how important language is, that your words for some people get together and talk about came out. So we know the last 20 years beyond, Somalia has produced a language that holds and based on the structure of bloodshed. And we know if you look at the direction of the people, whatever it is, you look at language, and based on what language they're using, you can project where they're going. How do we coin a new language that's based on, that understands the language that came to war? That only is a new language, so people can power, can sing, can do whatever, everything. You do, and then perhaps this will come.
well, I think that there are different periods of things. I'm not convinced that the poetry is all about war. There's a lot of it's all about love. My friend, and so you're looking at a lot of people plays from Djibouti to every corner. So I don't subscribe to that idea that the language is all war or everything is violent. I think this is I think something that Christiana Amanpour would like to hear, not this place. So I think again, this comes with the question of centering everything in terms of diaspora, and they're having their idea of being in the center. I think that needs to be reconfigured, and then saying that there are people who are living there, and these people have solutions and ways. It really is something that harkens back to that Bado and Reimagining situation, where in a Fanonian sense, because you're a city dweller, you know more having drank from the water of modernity, quote unquote. And so now you're trying to re-export back this enlightened Western knowledge. But let me just finish. So the thing is that, and I'm speaking not at you but saying generally, I sense there's also a lot of definitiveness when it comes to Somali affairs. People are saying these people are this way, that way, and sometimes you wonder why people don't necessarily take a moment to trouble and look at it in depth and see what is there and what we're living in a time where there are several movements, right? There are people who are living in Toronto. There are people who are living in Nairobi. There are people who are living in Puntland. Oh, so we are all Somalis. But the case is always, I think it's very fluid. So I'm not saying that there is no war poetry, but I don't know if we really are missing the cultural work and when I went to Hargeisa book fair, I think there was about 20 young guys who had written, and women who had written books in Somali and poetry. So how do I say that this doesn't exist? Then you realize that actually we're trying to center ourselves as the vision of looking at Somali from this very far place. So we're actually doing what the center does to the periphery, but in a way. So that's what I think.
Just to add to what you are saying, I think.
I'm sorry, you don't have a rebuttal, right? Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Talk back. I can talk back. Yeah, that's what I mean.
I lost my thoughts.
Okay.
Oh, no, the thing, I understand what you're saying, but the thing that's supposed to be true is the things that often makes you agitated or upset. I'm not saying you are, I'm saying in Somalia, we dealt with 20 years of war, and language is important. Without language, the war would not
Yeah, I also added I added Mogadishu. I also added Mogadishu. So while Mogadishu, yeah. Yes, I understand. I mean, I've tried to say that your concept is a little too definitive in the sense that you're not considering all this work that is going on. And also, the language that is produced everywhere, whether it's Djibouti or elsewhere, is part of the living language. It's not. It doesn't have a localized habitat, right? And it, it runs the gamut. So you can't say that one has to be here and there. And even if you look at the war and what's going on, there is skirmishes, there's this and that, but at the same time, this is not the entire story or even the show itself. See, Marka, I think شكرا وإن حوجا يلعسد إن لصاروا يتكلم الجريمة ماشي. Very fine, right?
Let me sort of add. I think if we really want to get out of this sticky, we have to go back to the definition of the word Sudan itself. Sudan, literature. Perhaps some of my good friends used to talk about this. Now, think about this. Sudan كلمة. How many of you Somalis would know its etymology? حاجة تعالى. كلمة etymology. The origin, yeah.
And I didn't hear that.
No, the etymology of the word, what the origin of the word itself.
So it's gonna answer.
Sorry, can answer, I'm sure.
Go ahead.
Yes, Professor.
Sudan, number one, from weather climate.
Precisely, yeah.
It's about the art of carrying the concepts of containers from the climatic changes of the weather. Sudan, it changes from somewhere. From the rocks of the rain, the rocky streets, you will smell exactly the breeze that way. They say that is the Sudan coming from that rain. I think the rain is on the ground, and then the vanguard, somebody goes there to find out how it rain was, had rain on that. We don't measure by inches of the drops of the rain. They measure by how deep the water went into the soil, because that's the reality of the use of water in the land. And then they found out how much Sudan was left in that area. And then they go, when green grass grows over the area, and someone finds also, again, find out how much grass is there. Because, yeah, that tree left a grass of Sudan over there.
Let me add to this also. But Sudan, when we said it, at least what my mother used to tell me, Sudan is the sap that you find in particular plants in Somalia, like desert yurt. You have heard of the desert yurt? Yeah, desert yurt. And it's the sap, that tree, that plant is evergreen. When all else is gone, when everything dies because of the drought, it's that tree that literally sustains life. And it's called Sudan, the self itself. So we have to go back to the origin of the word. That's what I'm saying. To really talk about poetry and yeah.
Go ahead, Sophia. We have online questions.
Yeah, maybe. Sophia. Christian, you have your hand all day.
Go ahead. Who?
Yeah.
Okay, so my question was kind of coming back on what you were talking earlier about how women and minorities and other kind of people have to tell their own stories. So what happens oftentimes is when you tell your own story, words stop. And so I wonder
back again, and not only from other scholars, but also from scholars.
Don't even think about it. That's my response. Seriously, I don't really give a hoot, if I can use them, to what people think of my writings, for example. There is an Arabic, no, seriously, it says there is an Arabic saying, if you try to appease and satisfy all people, it won't be possible. And there's an Arabic saying that says, لو كنت كالقدح في التقديم المعتدلة لقالت الناس هذا غير معتدل. If you were straight as a cup, they say, there will always be people who say it's crooked. And in East Africa, we used to be Sharia. What does it mean? No, seriously, what it means is this is the Chinese. This is my truth. This is your truth. Let's strive for that truth that is outside us. And in Islam, for example, in Islam, the Rasul says, Al-Hibdullah, Balatullah. Think about it. Balatullah, wisdom, he says, is like an stray animal. You lost that animal. You know what you lost, but you don't really know where it is. And it's that sort of striving, like pearl fishing in the sense of Hannah Arendt, for example, saying pearl fishing. You go into the ocean, you know the pearl somewhere is there, but you don't really know where. So now you grow. The important thing for me is that it's never done with spite and sort of, or what it becomes in the true sense of the word is really serve a quest for knowledge. But if someone says you are not objective, what does the word itself mean? What does objectivity mean? Who's objective? What does objectivity mean? And who cares?
I would add, seek solace from previous folks. Like this question was posed to Baldwin at in '86 or '87. I'm not sure the time at the press club. And he was asked, "What do you think about Alice Wolf, Toni Morrison, and a couple of other women who are coming up and taking the literary mantle?" And he has a very wonderful way of looking at it. So those are the places where you'll get some answers, because some of these answers are unanswerable, but you find them as you read or as you see them, you find solace in certain things that other scholars and other people have gone through. But I do recommend that because it poses that question where before Baldwin there was Wright, Ellison, and so it was pretty much male dominated. That's all. Yeah, we can go ahead, take the mic. Getting crowded here.
Yeah, so these are actually going to be the last two questions. We do have the space for some time, and this is both a keynote and a reception. So you're more than welcome afterwards to talk amongst yourselves, to speak to the keynote, to speak to Abu Latif afterwards, and we do have some food in the back as well. So these are two questions from online. I'm going to ask them at the same time. One is from Twitter, and this person asks, how could academics forge a unified narrative on Somali studies? Put differently, can academics reclaim Somali studies? If yes, how? The second is actually a voice note. I believe the question's in Somali, so you can translate it briefly, and this is on the question of accessibility. I'm going to try this.
dadka sidaa camal way ku yihiin ummadda Soomaaliyeed hal qof baa tahay laakiin sidee way ummadda dhan ula xiriiri karaan xirfada kana baxsan ummadda oo jaamacooyinka laakiin qof walba oo ummadda dhan oo Soomaaliyeed ka tirsan sidee way ula xiriiri karaan.
So basically, I mean, asking on kind of us being in the academy, how do we reach out to everyday folks? Those are our two social media questions.
So it's been answered.
Yeah, actually, it dovetails with the young lady who asked that question in terms of accessibility before. In terms of a unified front, Safia, I would rather really have no unified front. For one reason. Remember, before I talked about the importance of really coming together, but at the same time also not in the sense that we become card carrying that front, because then we would run into a lot of problems. Unified in the sense, I think, with all the diversity in our discussions, I think what becomes important is from now on to literally take charge, the way you have done now. And I'm sure you are lucky now, we are all lucky, that Hussein himself is here. The father of Somali Studies is here. And I'm sure he will give you his barakah and blessings. So you take charge. And that's how we form, and we take it from there. In terms of the question in Somali, the Netherlands is really very generous. I'm not only one, I'm one among them. And we are really building on the shoulders of people like Hussein, of people like Ludwig, of people like Lee, of people like Said, of people like the Samata brothers, of people, and it goes on and on. Abdi is here. And I'm coming to Mukhtar. How can I forget about Mukhtar? And Muhammad Hadi Mukhtar, Eno, Abdi Kuso, it goes on and on and on. And I think what becomes really important is one of the, another one is Reimagining. This is where I really go back. Charity begins at home. There is real freedom, the way I see it. There is something that Toni Morrison says in Brilliant, I think. And she says something about freedom, she says, is when you no longer recognize yourself. Just imagine, real freedom, which is something akin to what you find the late Gordana in Berger's daughter, for example, would be saying. In other words, we have to literally start with ourselves, but build those connections and networks and take charge. There is no need to sort of delegate this to some, or even to some really group of people who form and found a journal, and there is no one Somali on that board. It's preposterous. Think about it, seriously. It's again, you go back to the idea of, yes, you can't really represent yourself. There are places that you can't speak. We represent you, we speak for you. That is gone. And we have to do that sort of, I think, activism in a way.
Okay, so thank you, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Ali Jamala Ahmed, for a brilliant lecture. Thank you, Abdi Latif, for facilitating, and all of you for your wonderful questions. This is, bear in mind, first day of 2. Tomorrow we'll be meeting in Robinson Hall, which is just up Quincy Street. It's in the same area, Robinson Hall, the lower library, for a full-day workshop. And the first panel begins at 9:15 tomorrow, right through until about 5:30, which is the closing roundtable. And we'll have breaks, of course, refreshments are there, lunch. So I hope you can all join us then. For now, there's some food in the back. Please feel free to discuss, to approach our keynote, to talk amongst yourselves, to talk to me, to Abdi Latif, to everyone who's participating in the workshop. And I thank you all for coming.
Thank you.